The Senate chamber fell into stunned silence as Lindsey Graham erupted, his voice booming, his finger jabbing, his face flushed with a fury that seemed to rise out of nowhere. The marble walls caught every echo, amplifying his outrage until it thundered like a storm over the packed chamber. Senators leaned back in their chairs, staffers froze mid-note, and the audience in the gallery craned their necks forward, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Graham's voice wasn't measured debate. It wasn't reasoned argument. It was a full-throated eruption, the kind that teeters between theater and desperation. He pointed across the chamber, his words laced with indignation, painting a picture of betrayal, weakness, and imagined enemies. The longer he shouted, the clearer it became. This wasn't confidence, it was panic cloaked in anger. His voice cracked, his hands shook ever so slightly, and behind the thunder, there was a man rattled by the very questions he was trying to drown out. The lights above beamed down harshly, catching every bead of sweat on his brow, every flicker of strain across his face. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing his jaw clenched tight, his fists slamming on the desk. Online, snippets of the eruption were already being clipped, shared, and spread like wildfire. The captions wrote themselves, unhinged. Out of control. Is this leadership? Yet amid the chaos of Graham's outburst, one figure remained utterly still. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to meet the fire with fire. Instead, she let the storm rage, her silence louder than his shouting, her composure a mirror reflecting the desperation in his attack. Senators glanced at her, almost incredulous. How could anyone remain so calm under such bombardment? It was a silence that spoke volumes, a patience that hinted not at weakness, but at power waiting to be unleashed. Each second stretched longer, the tension twisting tighter. Viewers at home, scrolling their feeds, couldn't look away. They knew a clash was coming, but not like this, not in the way that would soon unfold. Because what Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver would not just quiet the chamber. It would reverberate far beyond those walls. No one in that chamber expected what Jasmine Crockett would do next. This wasn't just another day on Capitol Hill. The hearing had already been marked on every political calendar as one of the most consequential of the season, a clash over a high-profile issue that cut straight to the heart of America's future. Lobbyists packed the corridors, reporters lined up for sound bites, and cameras hung on every word like predators waiting for the kill. This was no sleepy procedural debate, this was the kind of hearing that shapes headlines, careers, and legacies. And in the center of it all, two figures couldn't have stood in sharper contrast. On one side, Senator Lindsey Graham, a man whose decades in Washington had given him both stature and swagger. He had the air of someone who believed the chamber itself was built to amplify his voice, his experience, his dominance. The weight of seniority was his armor, and he wore it heavily, expecting deference with every syllable. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, younger, newer to the national stage, and yet carrying a presence that radiated an entirely different kind of power. Where Graham's voice cracked with fury, hers carried a calm steadiness. Where he relied on years of entitlement and established rank, she embodied the hunger of a generation unwilling to be silenced. The contrast was impossible to ignore, a senior senator leaning on his name, and a rising congresswoman whose strength came from something less fragile, conviction. But Graham didn't see that. Or rather, he refused to. To him, Crockett was an easy target, a convenient symbol of what he saw as the problem with modern politics: younger voices daring to challenge the old guard, women standing firm in spaces long dominated by men, and voices of color refusing to wait their turn. He jabbed his finger not just at her words, but at her very presence, his tone dripping with dismissal. His rage wasn't just disagreement, it was disdain. That's why this moment mattered. It wasn't simply a senator disagreeing with a colleague. It was an embodiment of a deeper struggle: entitlement versus equality, tradition versus change, arrogance versus dignity. Graham wasn't just arguing policy, he was clinging to an era where his voice could thunder unopposed, where silence from those across from him was expected, even demanded. And yet, Jasmine Crockett sat there, unbothered. Her composure was not passivity, but a deliberate choice. Every second she waited, every breath she held back, was fuel for what was coming. Those who knew her record, her reputation, leaned forward, because they sensed it. Crockett was not about to let this pass. She was calculating, choosing her moment carefully, because when she struck, it wouldn't just be a retort. It would be a statement. This was the new face of American politics, a younger generation no longer content to sit quietly while the old guard shouted them down. And Crockett was about to embody that shift in real time. It wasn't about ego or theatrics, it was about something larger, the idea that truth, composure, and courage could cut sharper than volume or seniority ever could. The imbalance of power that Graham thought he could exploit was about to collapse. The senior senator, banking on intimidation, didn't realize he was walking straight into a political trap of his own making. Because what followed wasn't just a response. It wasn't just Crockett defending herself. It was a moment destined for the history books, a clash where arrogance met dignity, and only one would emerge standing. Lindsey Graham was no stranger to the spotlight. For decades, his name had been etched into the machinery of Washington politics, his voice a constant presence in Senate chambers and on Sunday morning talk shows. He carried with him the polish of tenure, a man who had weathered countless political storms and always found a way to emerge standing. But beneath that veneer of resilience lay a reputation just as infamous as it was enduring: bluster, contradiction, and a flair for the dramatic. Graham had built his career on the art of performance. Early in his tenure, he positioned himself as a fiery truth-teller, unafraid to spar with members of his own party, earning a reputation as a maverick voice of accountability. He once railed against unchecked power, warning about the dangers of blind loyalty to a single leader. He gave soaring speeches about principle, duty, and the Constitution, wrapping himself in the language of guardianship. For a time, it worked. He was seen as a man willing to cross lines for the sake of integrity. But as the years pressed forward, the cracks began to show. His fiery rhetoric remained, but it no longer aligned with his actions. The man who once cautioned against extremism now stood shoulder to shoulder with those very forces. His alliances shifted, not with conviction, but with calculation. He became a symbol of survival politics, someone willing to bend and twist his positions if it meant staying close to power. Where he once spoke of accountability, he now sneered at those who dared to demand it. Where he once championed restraint, he now wielded outrage like a weapon, thundering at opponents as though sheer volume could erase his contradictions. And so, when Graham erupted in the Senate chamber, his voice booming and his finger jabbing, it was not a moment out of character. It was the culmination of years of performance perfected into habit. His anger was familiar, his theatrics expected. He roared not just at Jasmine Crockett, but at the very idea that anyone younger, newer, and less deferential could challenge the authority he had long wielded unchecked. Yet his fury revealed more than he intended. The louder Graham roared, the more cracks began to show. Those who had tracked his career could hear it, the desperation threaded through the bluster, the fragility beneath the force. His booming voice was no longer the unshakable authority of a seasoned statesman. It sounded instead like the brittle echoes of a man clinging to relevance, terrified that his era was slipping away. The contradictions haunted him. This was the same Graham who had once called for unity, now spewing division. The same senator who once warned against anger in politics, now embodying it with every red-faced shout. He had once been a man of caution, now he was a caricature of his own excess. To those watching closely, the performance was not strength, it was unraveling. And in that unraveling, he became the perfect antagonist. He was not a villain in the cartoonish sense, but in the archetype that resonates in every great political drama: arrogance dressed as authority, contradiction disguised as conviction, dismissal passed off as dominance. His weapon was volume, his shield was tenure, and his weakness was the one thing he could not control, the rise of voices he could no longer silence. When Graham leaned forward in that Senate chamber, his words dripping with disdain for Crockett, it wasn't just policy he was defending. It was legacy. It was ego. It was the idea that the chamber still belonged to him, that the world had not changed beyond his reach. But the chamber had changed. The nation had changed. And in that moment, the very walls seemed to whisper a truth Graham refused to face. His thunder no longer carried the same weight. The tragedy of Lindsey Graham's persona was not simply that he shouted. It was that his shouting no longer inspired fear, but pity. The spectacle of his rage had become predictable, almost hollow. And when Jasmine Crockett sat there, her calm composure holding steady against his storm, it magnified his contradictions tenfold. His fury was supposed to overwhelm, instead, it exposed. The louder Graham roared, the more his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The audience saw it. The cameras caught it. And Crockett, ever patient, recognized it. She knew that this wasn't just a man shouting down an opponent, it was a man shouting against the tide of history. Every hero needs a villain, and in that Senate chamber, Graham played the part to perfection. Not because he was powerful, but because he revealed himself to be trapped by the very arrogance and contradictions he had spent a career perfecting. And in the silence that followed his tirade, as all eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett, the stage was set for the kind of clash that defines not just headlines, but eras. Because what happens when arrogance meets calm, when bluster meets conviction, is not merely debate. It is reckoning. And Graham, in all his roaring, had unknowingly written himself into the role of antagonist in a story much bigger than his own voice. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marbled halls of Congress, nor under the glow of cameras in a Senate chamber. It began in the grit of everyday struggle, the kind of struggle familiar to those who refuse to inherit a world of injustice without daring to challenge it. Born into a working-class family, she grew up with a front-row view of what inequity looked like in real time, the communities overlooked, the voices silenced, the opportunities denied. For some, those realities hardened into resignation. For Jasmine, they became fuel. Long before she ever raised her hand to be sworn into office, Crockett was raising her voice for those who had been ignored. As a lawyer, she took on cases others avoided, standing beside clients who could not afford powerful representation but deserved it nonetheless. Courtrooms became her proving grounds, where her sharp mind and relentless drive clashed against the weight of systemic inequities. She built her career not on chasing wealth or prestige, but on chasing justice, often fighting uphill battles where victory was never guaranteed, but dignity was always worth defending. Her colleagues recall the same thing: she never backed down. Whether in cramped offices or crowded courtrooms, Jasmine carried herself with a blend of grit and grace, a fire tempered by purpose. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to have her youth or her gender or her background used as a weapon against her credibility. She wore those doubts not as wounds, but as armor. Each condescending glance, each dismissive word, each attempt to sideline her only sharpened her resolve. That resolve propelled her into politics. Running for office wasn't a decision made out of ambition alone, it was a response to the communities crying out for voices like hers. She campaigned not with the polish of insiders but with the authenticity of someone who had lived the realities she spoke about. On doorsteps and in town halls, she spoke of equity, of dignity, of opportunity not as abstract ideals but as necessities that should belong to everyone. And people listened. Not because she promised miracles, but because she embodied resilience. She was the kind of leader who carried scars and turned them into strength. In Washington, where power often dulls conviction, Jasmine remained unshaken. She arrived not to be absorbed into the machinery but to disrupt it. Her values, justice, equality, accountability, weren't talking points. They were lifelines she refused to let go of. She understood what was at stake because she had lived it. And in a chamber filled with voices that had long dismissed the struggles of everyday people, hers rang out as something undeniable. That is what made the clash with Lindsey Graham so potent. It was not simply a generational showdown. It was a confrontation between two very different Americas, one clinging to entitlement, the other demanding equity. Graham wielded decades of seniority, Crockett carried the weight of lived experience. He had mastered the art of performance, she had mastered the art of perseverance. He thundered to hold the floor, she stood steady to hold the truth. Her calmness in that moment was not accidental. It was earned. Every courtroom argument, every long night poring over briefs, every campaign trail insult hurled her way, they had prepared her. Every attempt to sideline her, every suggestion that she wait her turn, every barrier meant to slow her ascent, they had steeled her. She had fought too hard, risen too far, and carried too many stories on her shoulders to squander the moment by matching Graham's bluster with her own. Because Crockett understood something fundamental, true power is not in the loudest voice but in the sharpest clarity. Her journey had taught her that shouting may command attention, but integrity commands respect. And respect, once earned, cannot be taken away. This was the Jasmine Crockett who sat there in the Senate chamber, listening to Graham's fury. To some, her stillness might have looked passive. But to anyone who knew her story, it was the stillness of strategy, the composure of someone who had fought harder battles and carried heavier burdens. It was not fear. It was preparation. Her advocacy for justice was not born in theory. It was born in nights spent fighting for clients no one else would fight for, in days spent navigating systems that tried to push her aside, in years spent standing taller than the obstacles placed before her. She had seen the machinery of injustice up close, and she had chosen to face it head-on. That choice defined her career, her reputation, and now, her role in this historic clash. So when Graham's voice echoed through the chamber, booming and trembling with the weight of ego and desperation, Crockett's calm presence became something larger than demeanor. It became a statement. A refusal to yield. A quiet but unshakable reminder that she belonged in that chamber just as much as anyone else, and that no amount of shouting would strip her of that truth. What made her perfect for this moment wasn't simply her intellect or her composure. It was the journey that had carried her here. She wasn't just standing against Lindsey Graham, she was standing on behalf of every person who had been told they weren't enough, every community dismissed as unworthy, every younger voice told to wait their turn. In her story, those people saw themselves. And in this confrontation, they saw their validation. Every fight in her journey had prepared her for this exact moment. Every courtroom battle, every campaign trail setback, every injustice she dared to name had built toward this crescendo. And as she prepared to respond, the air in the chamber thickened with anticipation. Because the power of her story wasn't just in her survival, it was in her readiness to redefine what survival meant. It wasn't about getting through the storm. It was about standing in its eye and daring it to break against her. And as Graham's echoes faded into silence, all eyes turned toward Jasmine Crockett. Calm. Steady. Unmoved. What she would say next would not only shatter the chamber's silence, it would carve her name into the annals of modern political history. The Senate chamber is no stranger to heated exchanges, but this moment carried a charge that was impossible to ignore. Lindsey Graham, red-faced and unrelenting, had shifted from sharp questioning to outright shouting. His words weren't carefully measured arguments, they were fireballs of anger hurled across the chamber, meant to intimidate, to dominate, to silence. Each sentence landed with the blunt force of entitlement, reverberating through marble walls and rattling those watching with the sheer spectacle of his rage. His voice cracked the air like thunder, demanding, belittling, dismissive. It wasn't just a debate, it was a display of power, the kind that older politicians often wield when they feel their grip slipping. Graham, a senior senator with decades of experience, seemed to believe volume alone could shield him from accountability. He paced with his words, his hands cutting through the air, his face flushed with the effort of holding control by sheer force. But the more he roared, the more it became clear that control was slipping through his fingers. The chamber was no longer hearing his arguments, they were witnessing his unraveling. What was meant to project strength instead revealed cracks, the desperation of someone who believed his authority was enough to override reason. Every attempt to shout down dissent only underscored the weakness of his position. And across from him sat Jasmine Crockett. Silent. Still. Unshaken. Her posture told a story all its own. She did not flinch. She did not attempt to interrupt. She simply watched, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. Where Graham embodied chaos, she embodied calm. Where his words came crashing like waves, hers sat poised like the tide, waiting, inevitable, unstoppable. For those in the chamber, the contrast was striking. One figure battling against his own temper, another figure harnessing the power of patience. Graham's booming voice filled every corner, but Crockett's silence carried its own weight. She wasn't cowed by the outburst, she was preparing for it to burn itself out. And the longer she remained composed, the more obvious the imbalance became. The spectacle shifted the energy in the room. Senators leaned forward. Staffers exchanged glances. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, already sensing this was more than a routine argument. This was theater, yes, but it was also revelation, the old guard grappling desperately to hold on, the new guard quietly biding its time. Each of Graham's shouts seemed to grow louder, more strained, as if he could sense his grip slipping. He leaned on his seniority, his tenure, his history, all the symbols of power that had served him well for decades. But none of it seemed to touch Crockett. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her strength was in her refusal to be shaken. She had no need to meet chaos with chaos, calmness was its own form of resistance. Observers outside the chamber would later note how Crockett's silence became its own kind of answer. The louder Graham grew, the more dignified her stillness appeared. The angrier he became, the more powerful her composure seemed. In the clash between noise and quiet, it was the quiet that held sway. And then came the pause. Graham, after what seemed like an endless barrage of shouting, finally stopped to catch his breath. His voice had filled the chamber for so long that the silence felt deafening. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Slowly, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her gaze steady, her voice still unsound but already commanding attention. The chamber seemed to tilt toward her, anticipation thick in the air. Senators shifted in their seats. The gallery hushed. Even Graham, chest heaving from his tirade, fell into a tense stillness. Everyone knew what was coming. And yet no one could quite predict how it would land. Because Crockett's strength wasn't in matching Graham's anger, it was in dismantling it with precision. Her journey had trained her for this, and her silence had prepared the ground. And then, with the entire chamber waiting, she finally spoke. The chamber was hushed. The air hung heavy, vibrating with the echoes of Graham's tirade. His voice had filled every inch of the space, loud, brash, relentless. Now, silence pressed down like a weight, broken only by the faint rustle of papers and the click of pens. And then Jasmine Crockett leaned in. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, the kind of composure that spoke volumes without a single word. For a moment, she simply looked at Graham, not with fear, not even with anger, but with the calm intensity of someone who had already decided how this story would end. Every eye in the chamber was on her. Staffers froze in place, senators tilted forward, and reporters, sensing the impending headline, sharpened their focus. Lindsey Graham had spent his energy shouting. Jasmine Crockett was about to make hers count. Beat 1, the setup, acknowledging his attack. Her voice, when it came, was measured, low but clear, steady enough to cut through the silence like a blade. Senator Graham, she began, her tone almost gentle, as though she were a teacher addressing an unruly student. I listened carefully to your words. I listened to your volume. And I listened to your anger. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Graham stiffened, his jaw tight. I respect passion, she continued. But passion is not proof. And shouting is not substance. The chamber reacted with the faintest ripple, a shuffle of shoes, a murmur quickly hushed. Graham shifted uncomfortably, already sensing that the ground beneath him was shifting. Crockett didn't rush. She let the silence work for her, wielding patience like a weapon. Every second of pause tightened the anticipation, making the chamber lean further into her every syllable. Beat 2, the reframe, turning his insults into strength. You called me inexperienced. You called me unprepared, she said, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his. But Senator, what you really revealed with those words was not my weakness, it was your fear. The words sliced cleanly, precise and unflinching. You fear what my presence here represents, a new generation unwilling to accept politics as usual. You fear that I will not be silenced by tradition, by hierarchy, or by the way things have always been done. You fear that my very existence here means your old ways of intimidation no longer work. A soft wave of murmurs rolled through the chamber. The younger aides and staffers exchanged quick glances. This was not just a rebuttal, it was a redefinition of the playing field. Crockett continued, her voice rising ever so slightly, not in anger, but in conviction. You see, Senator, you thought your volume could overshadow me. But what you didn't realize is that I don't need to be louder than you. I only need to be clearer. She leaned back slightly, her poise radiating control. Graham, visibly rattled now, muttered something under his breath, but it was drowned out by the silence of those who knew his bluster had lost its edge. Beat 3, the punchline, the clapback. And then came the moment. Crockett let the pause stretch, her gaze sweeping the room, as if gathering the energy of every eye fixed on her. She leaned in again, her tone sharpened with precision. Senator Graham, she said, her words landing with surgical exactness, if experience means learning to shout instead of listen, if it means abandoning principles for power, if it means using fear instead of facts, then you're right. I hope I never have as much experience as you. The chamber froze. For a heartbeat, there was silence, absolute, electrifying silence. And then, like the faint rumble before a storm, reactions began to stir. A muffled gasp from the gallery. A subtle grin from a colleague 2 rows back. Reporters scribbling so furiously their pens scratched audibly against paper. Graham's face flushed deeper, the redness now tinged with something that looked far closer to humiliation than fury. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. His weapon, his voice, had been neutralized. The shift in power. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her tone. She simply sat back, her composure intact, the mic drop moment still hanging heavy in the air. And it was then that the full shift revealed itself. The audience was no longer watching Graham, no longer measuring his words or his authority. All attention had pivoted to Crockett. She was the center of gravity now. Whispers fluttered like paper in the wind. Staffers tried to suppress their smirks. Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't deny the force of the moment. The balance of power in that room had tilted, and everyone felt it. Graham's attempt to reassert dominance had collapsed beneath the weight of Crockett's composure. His fury had backfired, leaving him exposed. Hers, meanwhile, had solidified into something unshakable. The chamber reacts. The reactions were subtle, but telling. A senator on the opposite bench leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Graham with a mix of bemusement and disbelief. Another shook her head, lips pressed tightly together to hide the smile tugging at the corners. Journalists exchanged glances as if to silently say, "We just got our headline." Even among Graham's allies, there was a discomfort, a realization that his fury had not only failed but had handed Crockett the moral high ground. She hadn't just defended herself. She had reframed the entire confrontation into a broader message about politics, integrity, and the shifting tides of generational power. The cliffhanger. And yet, as powerful as the moment was inside the chamber, the true explosion had not yet begun. Because what happens in Washington rarely stays in Washington. Cameras had captured every detail, Graham's outburst, Crockett's poise, the clapback that silenced the room. By the time the session ended, clips were already being shared. Tweets, captions, and headlines sprouted like wildfire. The chamber had witnessed the mic drop, but the world was about to amplify it. And so, as the Senate returned to order, as Graham avoided eye contact and Crockett sat calm and steady, the story was only just beginning. Because the real explosion wasn't in the Senate chamber, it was online. The chamber had fallen back into procedural rhythm, but outside those walls, the battle was just beginning. What had unfolded in a few tense minutes was already spilling into the bloodstream of the internet, where attention is currency and perception becomes power. The online detonation. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. The moment Crockett delivered her mic drop line, "I hope I never have as much experience as you," looped endlessly across timelines. Someone clipped the exact 3-second sequence and paired it with a booming bass drop, another slowed the footage to highlight the instant Graham's jaw went slack. On Twitter, the hashtags erupted. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Sit Down Lindsey. Hashtag New Politics. By the hour's end, all three trended nationally. TikTok creators stitched the clip into dances, reaction videos, and even lip-sync parodies. Memes multiplied, side-by-side screenshots of Graham's reddened face and Crockett's cool, composed expression, captioned with lines like volume versus value and when experience means yelling, I'll pass. Crockett's words had transcended the chamber. They had become part of the internet's cultural shorthand. Commentators pile in. Cable news wasted no time. Political commentators who usually parsed votes and bills now replayed the confrontation in slow motion, analyzing tone, body language, and rhetorical structure like sports analysts reviewing a championship play. On one side of the screen, Graham, visibly rattled, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fury. On the other, Crockett, calm, deliberate, almost cinematic in her restraint. She didn't just answer him, one commentator remarked on CNN. She exposed the imbalance. He was swinging wildly, she was standing firmly. That contrast is why this moment resonates. On MSNBC, a panelist called it the generational dividing line drawn live on C-SPAN. Even conservative outlets, though critical of Crockett's politics, admitted the optics had not favored Graham. One commentator sighed on Fox News, he looked out of control. And in politics, perception is half the battle. The generational divide. What struck observers most was how clearly the exchange illustrated a generational shift. For decades, the Senate had been dominated by loud voices, procedural games, and hierarchy-driven intimidation. Graham's style, fiery monologues, red-faced outrage, was a textbook example of old-guard politics. But Crockett's style spoke to something new, measured delivery, sharp reframing, and an understanding that the true audience wasn't only in the chamber, but online. Young viewers in particular latched onto her performance as proof that politics could feel authentic. Finally, someone who speaks like us, one viral tweet read, racking up 500,000 likes. College students began circulating the clip with captions like, "This is why we vote." Meanwhile, older commentators lamented Graham's loss of control. To them, the exchange symbolized how the methods that once ruled the Senate, intimidation, seniority, dominance, no longer held the same sway. Crockett as the truth teller. Public reaction framed Crockett as something beyond just a participant in the hearing. She became the truth teller. Her ability to calmly hold her ground while dismantling Graham's attacks resonated across demographics, but especially with those frustrated by politics as usual. Editorials praised her composure. One headline in the Washington Post read, "When the chamber shouted, she listened, and then she spoke." Even late-night hosts joined the chorus. On The Daily Show, the host played the clip, pausing to quip, "Graham brought the fire, but Crockett brought the extinguisher." The audience roared, and the moment replayed once more. For Crockett, the perception was clear, she was authentic, fearless, and unwilling to play by the old rules. For Graham, the damage was equally stark, he appeared out of touch, unable to adapt, and trapped in emotive politics that looked outdated under the bright lights of social media. The ripple effect. The consequences extended far beyond a single hearing. Donors noticed. Activist groups began circulating fundraising emails with Crockett's words as the centerpiece, "We need more leaders who stand strong against the old politics. Help us support them." Political science professors cited the moment in classrooms as a study in modern rhetoric, contrasting Crockett's methodical composure with Graham's combustible anger. Even within the Senate, the effect lingered. Lawmakers who had dismissed Crockett as a newcomer were now more cautious, aware she could not be easily dismissed. Staffers whispered about the shift in energy, about how one exchange had upended dynamics more than months of debate. And perhaps most tellingly, everyday people, far removed from the marble halls, felt seen. In barbershops, in classrooms, in group chats, people repeated her words as if they were their own. The clapback wasn't just commentary, it had become a rallying cry. A moment that echoed. The Senate hearing itself would fade into the record, but Crockett's response carved itself into collective memory. It was more than a rebuttal. It was a reminder that the future of politics might not belong to those who shouted the loudest, but to those who spoke the clearest. And so, as the clip continued to surge online, as hashtags multiplied and pundits debated, the ripples grew. One chamber had been silenced. But the country, it seemed, had just begun to speak. The dust of the confrontation had long settled, but the meaning lingered. What remained wasn't just a sharp exchange in the Senate, it was a lesson, carved into memory, about the power of composure when chaos reigns. Dignity under fire. Jasmine Crockett had faced an all-too-familiar scenario, a powerful voice attempting to bulldoze, belittle, and drown out. Yet instead of engaging in a shouting match or letting herself be rattled, she chose the opposite path. She stood in dignity. She listened, measured her response, and let silence work for her until it was time to speak. Her poise under pressure transformed the hearing from another partisan skirmish into something far more symbolic. She became the embodiment of a timeless truth: it is not always the volume of your words that carries weight, but the steadiness of your spirit. The crumbling of old politics. Lindsey Graham's tantrum, by contrast, looked like the last gasp of a fading political playbook. For years, politics thrived on dominance: who could talk longest, who could shout loudest, who could command the room by force rather than reason. That style once intimidated opponents and cowed audiences. But in this moment, it failed spectacularly. His raised voice didn't project strength, it exposed insecurity. His fury didn't command respect, it revealed fragility. What had once been effective now seemed outdated, even embarrassing. To many watching, Graham became a symbol of old politics crumbling before their eyes. Not because he lacked passion, but because his passion was misplaced, directed at silencing rather than engaging, at overpowering rather than understanding. Calm courage versus rage. At the heart of the confrontation lay a universal moral: calm courage always outshines rage. When arrogance shouts, dignity waits. When chaos storms, resilience steadies the ground. Crockett demonstrated that true strength is not the ability to dominate the noise, but the ability to rise above it. History offers countless examples of this principle. Leaders who remain calm in crisis become the voices people remember. Think of how justice movements were led not by those who screamed the loudest, but by those who stood unwavering, unyielding, even in the face of fire hoses, prisons, and threats. In this small but potent echo of that truth, Crockett's restraint became revolutionary. It wasn't just political theater, it was a moral compass pointing forward. A new kind of leadership. The exchange illuminated a broader theme: the emergence of new leadership rooted in justice, resilience, and authenticity. This isn't leadership that thrives on intimidation. It doesn't rely on hierarchy or entitlement. Instead, it resonates with people because it feels honest, measured, and grounded. It is leadership that understands the world has changed, that voters, especially younger generations, see through bluster and are drawn to integrity. Crockett's example showed that the future belongs to those who can balance fire with focus, passion with patience. Leaders who recognize that politics isn't just about winning the room, it's about inspiring the world beyond it. The inspirational crescendo. As the story reverberated online and across communities, its moral deepened. People weren't just replaying a Senate argument, they were absorbing a reminder about their own lives. How often do we face voices that try to shout us down? How often are we tempted to answer rage with rage? Crockett's response offered a different path, the path of dignity, clarity, and courage. The lesson was not just political. It was universal: strength is quiet when it needs to be. Courage is calm when chaos erupts. Dignity endures when arrogance collapses. And so, the confrontation between Graham and Crockett became more than a viral clip. It became a parable of our times. The old politics of domination met the new politics of resilience, and the new one. The scene will be remembered not for the tantrum, but for the answer. Not for the shouting, but for the silence that carried weight. Not for arrogance, but for dignity. Because in the end, one truth stood tall, clear, and undeniable. When arrogance shouts, dignity speaks louder. In that Senate chamber, we witnessed more than a political spat, we witnessed a turning point. What began as another heated exchange in Washington transformed into a defining moment about power, integrity, and the future of leadership in America. Jasmine Crockett's calm yet commanding clapback was not just a rebuttal to Lindsey Graham's bluster, it was living proof that truth cuts deeper than noise. Where arrogance tried to dominate, dignity rose higher. Where rage tried to control, resilience reclaimed the narrative. The viral response wasn't an accident. Millions shared, clipped, and replayed that moment because it spoke to something bigger than politics. It was about life itself, about the battles we all face when others try to silence us, and the strength it takes to answer with clarity rather than chaos. Crockett didn't just win an exchange, she demonstrated a model of courage that resonates across generations. This is why her response mattered. Not only because she exposed the weakness in old-style grandstanding, but because she reminded us of a timeless truth: calm courage always wins. And now, the choice is ours, whether to let moments like this pass as entertainment, or to carry their message forward. If you believe in courage under fire, if you believe dignity outshines rage, then don't let this story end here. Share it. Talk about it. Keep it alive. Because every time we amplify voices of strength and truth, we help shape a future where respect beats ridicule, and leadership looks more like Crockett than Graham. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe now for more stories that prove it. When arrogance shouts, dignity speaks louder.